If I sound a little bit like Boris Karloff, it's because I had an allergy attack yesterday and my throat is all kind of raspy, so don't be frightened. And so I'm going to talk about central banking, and there's nothing more fun than a lecture on economics on a Sunday morning, especially a nice sunny Sunday morning. And what I'm going to start off with saying is that how interesting it was when the U.S. government first began bailing out big banks in New York City. The Wall Street Journal ran an article by a business historian named John Steele Gordon, blaming the whole mess, the whole recession and everything on Thomas Jefferson, the third American president. He called it the baleful influence of Thomas Jefferson and his anti-central bank philosophy. Jefferson opposed the first American central bank. It was called the Bank of the United States. And then Forbes magazine, another sort of mouthpiece of the Wall Street elite, ran an article that said, no, it wasn't just Jefferson and his anti-central bank ideas that's the problem. It's Ron Paul, too. Because Ron Paul is the contemporary purveyor of these ideas, of these critiques. And both of these articles argue that the real problem is the Fed, the American Central Bank, does not have enough power. And the reason it does not have enough power is that these ideas, these of opposing the Fed, live on, that were created by Thomas Jefferson. And we need to stamp out these critiques of central banking so that the central bank can be even more powerful than it is. Then we will no longer have business cycles. I'm not making this up. John Steele Gordon recited, the boom and bust of 1819 and 1929, and he pretty much said, if only the Fed had more power, none of this would have happened. And the reason I bring this up is that there is this ideology of the Fed, which is the Fed is the financier of the American empire. It's not the sole financier, but it always has been the financier of the American empire. And it has its defenders. The defenders of the empire have to defend the Fed. Without this sorts of financing, it would have been very difficult for the American empire to do many of the things it has done over the years. One book that I read a while back on the history of the American income tax, for example, the author said, thank goodness we got the Fed and the income tax in the year 1913. Otherwise, Americans could not have entered World War I. And I thought, well, happy days are here again. We entered World War I. Wasn't that a wonderful thing? And so I guess the point I want to make here is that there's this ideology of the Fed as a necessary institution for economic instability, but I think it's all a myth. It's all a myth. And so my point of departure here is I'm going to invoke another economist like me, the late George Stigler. And George Stigler won the Nobel Prize in Economics sometime in the early 80s. And I can recall when he was brought to the White House by President Reagan after winning the Nobel Prize, he started criticizing Reagan's economic policies. And they didn't actually have one of those canes, but somebody rushed out and dragged him off the stage when he was doing that. But one of the things Stigler was known for is he did many studies on the economics of government regulation, the effects of government regulation. And one of the conclusions of a lot of these studies is that Stigler always used to say, if you want to find out who really benefits from government regulation of any sort, the place to start your investigation is to find out who lobbied for the regulation, or the law, if you're talking about a law. Who lobbied, who wanted it. And that doesn't prove conclusively the effects of this regulation or law, but it's a pretty good place to start if you want to know. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that if you want to know who benefits or who has always benefited from the Fed, central banking, find out, well, who wanted it in the first place? What was the argument for it? And sometimes you have to sift through all the nonsense and the rhetoric to find this out. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about the American case of the origins of central banking in America to explain, well, just who this institution really serves. And it starts with a group of men in America at the early time of the country who really wanted to bring the whole British mercantilist system to America. The very system that they had just fought a revolution against The attitude of people like Alexander Hamilton and his fellow nationalists, as they were called, or federalists is what they were called, seems to me to be that it's a bad thing to be on the paying end of an empire where you're just cannon fodder and taxpayers. But it's a good thing to be the king. So if you're the king, if you're on the side of the tax collector, that's good. And they wanted to bring this system to America. And so how are they going to do this? Murray Rothbard explained it in his little book called The Mystery of Banking, and I think this is a perfect explanation of why these men wanted this institution. This is what Rothbard says. He says, their aim was to reimpose in the new United States a system of mercantilism and big government similar to that in Great Britain, against which the colonists had rebelled. The object was to have a strong central government, particularly a strong president or king as chief executive, built up by high taxes and heavy public debt. The strong government was to impose high tariffs to subsidize domestic manufacturers, develop a big navy to open up and subsidize foreign markets for American exports, and launch a massive system of internal public works, roads and canals financed by government. In short, the United States was to have a British system without Great Britain. The same thing. That's why my latest book, Hamilton's Curse, the subtitle is How Jefferson's Archenemy Betrayed the American Revolution. They had just fought a revolution against this, and Hamilton's political enemies said this. Are you crazy? We just fought a revolution against this system. Why would we want to impose it on ourselves? And a big mover and shaker in this, a political mover and shaker, was a man named Robert Morris, who was one of the financiers of the American Revolution. He pledged his own personal credit to borrow money to help finance the revolution, and he was very revered by George Washington and other of the American founders. And but Rothbard called, but he was a schemer, and Rothbard calls it the Morris scheme was, quote, to organize and head a central bank to provide cheap credit and expanded money for himself and his allies. The first bank, the very first government bank, was called the Bank of North America, and it was quote, deliberately modeled after the Bank of England. And this bank was given a monopoly in currency issue, but it became so untrustworthy, people didn't trust the currency, the value of the currency, and the currency became so devalued that it was privatized eventually. But the nationalists never gave up on their dream of having a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital that could finance subsidies to them and to open up foreign markets and finance a navy and big government and so forth. And so what did they do? They worked in politics. Morris got his protege, Alexander Hamilton, the job of Treasury Secretary. Now, probably the most famous contemporary biography of Hamilton is one by an author named Ron Chernow, and he explains how Hamilton got the job of Treasury Secretary. And he explains how Hamilton really knew very little or nothing about finance. The war was still going on. At the end of the Revolutionary War, Hamilton was thinking, well, what am I going to do after the war? He was one of George Washington's aides as a very young man. And so he figured he should contact Robert Morris for a job. Robert Morris was the big money man in America. That's, why not start at the top? That's like, a young college senior saying, what should I do? I'll give Bill Gates a call. See what should I do after I get out of school? And so he didn't know anything about economics and finance, but he knew of someone who did. He knew that Senator Timothy Pickering, who would later become a senator, who was George Washington's adjutant general. He was known to know something about economics and finance. So he asked Timothy Pickering from Massachusetts, to give him some things to read so he could learn something about economics, which he did. So he wrote Robert Morris a 30-page letter essentially saying, Mr. Morris, I agree with everything you say on the subject of economics. I think we need a central bank run by politicians, we need high tariffs, and we need government subsidies for roads and canals. And he was George Washington's aide, and so this must have been like a gold mine dropping in the lap of Robert Morris. Here's a close personal aide to George Washington, who was going to become president, contacting him, pretty much saying, I will be your puppet in the nation's capital, which he was. And it was the way he got the job was Morris wrote George Washington and recommended him for the job of Treasury Secretary. And according to Chernow in his book, George Washington turned to Hamilton and said, I didn't know you knew anything about finance. We never talked about it. But if Robert Morris wants you in the job, you got the job. So he did get the job. And one of the first things Hamilton did is to start lobbying to overthrow the Constitution that Americans had. It was called the Articles of Confederation. And the U.S. Constitution replaced that. So the Americans essentially seceded from their first Constitution. But Hamilton, at the Constitutional Convention, where they worked out this Constitution, Hamilton laid out his plan, which was really Morris's plan. It was a permanent president, you could call it a king, who would appoint all the governors of all the states who would have the power to veto all state legislation. So in other words, there would be a monopoly power in the executive, in the president, who would be more or less a king. And this was always tied to this economic agenda. They wanted to have essentially a dictator who would impose a central bank to finance subsidies to businesses like Morris's businesses, high protective tariffs to keep foreign competition out, and a big public debt to fuel the growth of government. So it wasn't just power for the sake of power. It was power for the sake of economic aggrandizement of the people in power. Mercantilism. It was the British system. And so, of course, he didn't succeed at that. They only got part of what they wanted in terms of more centralized government. And again, Murray Rothbard explains exactly what was going on here. I'll quote him again. He said, a critical part of this program was put through in 1791 by their leader, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, a disciple of Robert Morris. Hamilton put through Congress the first bank of the United States, modeled after the old Bank of North America, whose longtime president and former partner of Robert Morris, Thomas Willing of Philadelphia, was made president of the new bank. So Morris's business partner was made the president of this new bank. And there was a debate. George Washington asked Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton to make the case for and against the bank. And Jefferson made his case against it, and this is what still bugs to this day people like John Steele Gordon. And it came down to, for the lawyers in the audience might like this, I think it's boring as can be, but it came down to the necessary and proper clause of the U.S. Constitution, where the government has the right to all the delegated powers of the federal government in the U.S. The necessary and proper clause allows the government to do what's necessary and proper to carry these things out. Hamilton said, well, it's necessary for us to have a central bank. Jefferson said, no, it's just convenient. He said, we have banks. We don't need a special bank to put the tax dollars in. We have banks. We don't want a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital like the Bank of England. And Hamilton didn't really win the argument. What happened was George Washington owned a lot of land in Virginia, near where Washington, D.C. is, Mount Vernon, and he had been wanting the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., to extend right up adjacent to his property. But the current plan was that it would be 3 miles away. And so in return for extending the boundary of Washington, D.C. to abut George Washington's property, George Washington signed the legislation creating the Bank of the United States. So it was just old-fashioned pork barrel politics, or log rolling, whatever you want to call it, that gave us the first. Despite all these long-winded papers written by Jefferson, Hamilton, and others, it all came down to politics of how we got this bank. And so, what did the bank do? Well, I'll quote Rothbard again. They, of course, began immediately issuing paper money. He said, it issued millions of dollars in paper money and demand deposits, pyramiding on top of $2 million in specie. The bank invested heavily in U.S. government debt. The result of the outpouring of credit and paper money by this new Bank of the United States was an increase in prices of 72% from 1791 to 1796. So it immediately created huge inflation. And this bank had a 20-year charter, so it was to end after 20 years, and which it did. It was eventually snuffed out. But to this day, the American apologists for central banking, when they study this history or talk about it, most historians that I know of will say things like Jefferson was an agrarian, he didn't understand banks, and he was actually opposed to banking. And so they make him sound like a buffoon. He was an ignorant economic buffoon. He's opposed to banks in general. But once again, Rothbard sets it straight, and he wasn't opposed to banks in period. He was suspicious of bankers. Who wouldn't be in this day and age? Suspicious of bankers. But what he was opposed to was a government-run bank, government-controlled banking, as far as that goes. And there were other Americans who were very suspicious of this. John Taylor was a senator from Virginia. He said, "What was it that drove our forefathers to this country? Was it not the ecclesiastical core and perpetual monopolies of England and Scotland? Shall we suffer the same evils in this country?" So they saw this as a threat to the very principles of the American Revolution. Now, the bank was revived. The Bank of the United States became the second bank of the United States after the War of 1812. It started up again in 1817. And Murray Rothbard's doctoral dissertation at Columbia, many, many years ago, was on the Panic of 1819. What a coincidence. The bank goes back into business in 1817, and 2 years later there's a panic. And he makes the case that there was cause and effect here. And there's a great little book by James J. Kilpatrick, an American journalist, called The Sovereign States, that talks about this. And he says that the effect of this was the Bank of the United States ran into grave difficulties through mismanagement, speculation, and fraud. Consequently, there was a wave of hostility toward the Bank of the United States that swept the country, and this eventually led to the demise of the second Bank of the United States. Not only did a lot of people think it was creating economic instability and inflation, but political corruption. A lot of the monies were literally used to finance the political campaigns of supporters of the bank and of the whole nationalist agenda, and to criticize the opponents like President Andrew Jackson. And some of the states hated this bank so much that the state of Ohio, for example, when two branches of this Bank of the United States, the precursor of the Fed, opened up in Ohio, they imposed a $50,000 a year tax on each branch, and this was in the 1820s. And so, the idea was to tax it out of existence. And the Bank of the United States refused to pay, so the state of Ohio sent armed marshals to the bank with a big chest, and they went into the vaults, collected $100,000, and left. And so they took it. And other states did similar things. There were in my book I quote the state legislatures in Connecticut and elsewhere in America as condemning this bank, and it ultimately came down to a big confrontation with President Andrew Jackson, who vetoed the legislation that would have rechartered the bank for another 20 years. So the bank sort of faded away in the early 1840s, and so the good guys won, in my opinion, although they never give up. The bad guys never give up. Another claim that John Steele Gordon made, they're still out there, John Steele Gordon. He said this, it was resurrected during the American Civil War. Central banking was. The Bank of the United States was not, but there were national currency acts that led to a much greater centralization of the monetary authority in the United States. And John Steele Gordon, the man I mentioned at the beginning, he praises this. He says, the Civil War ended monetary chaos. And I also quote some pretty well-known economic historians like Jeff Hummel and Richard Timberlake as saying that this period from 1840 to 1862 or 63 was not perfect, but they both make the case that this was probably the most stable monetary system America ever had in that period. And I think they make a pretty good case that it was pretty good. But what about this claim that the Civil War ended monetary chaos? That's what Gordon said in the Wall Street Journal several months ago. Well, there's a scholarly book edited by Claudia Golden, who's an economic historian in the United States. She's very well known. She's a University of Chicago graduate. The book is called Strategic Factors in 19th Century American Economic Growth. And they looked at the post-Civil War era central banking regime. And they said it was, quote, characterized by monetary and cyclical instability, 4 banking panics, frequent stock market crashes, and other financial disturbances, end quote. And that's what Gordon says was an end to monetary chaos. And so it's not exactly right, I don't think. And so this is sort of the struggle that these mercantilists or neo-mercantilists have always wanted a central bank to fund a mercantilist empire. And time and time again, what did it do? It created economic instability, political corruption, and so forth. But they never gave up. They never gave up. And one of the things I like to do is I have a couple of quotes here to give you an idea of the sort of the flavor of this debate. When Andrew Jackson, the American president, vetoed the rechartering of the bank, he made a statement. And Rothbard points out that Jackson has gone down in history as sort of he was from Tennessee, a southern state, and a lot of historians portray him as a country bumpkin. Today we would call him a redneck, which maybe he was, I don't know. Maybe if he were alive today, he would probably chew lots of tobacco and go to NASCAR races or something like that. But he wrote some things. He did some good things and some bad things. But this one statement that he or whoever his assistants were who wrote was a very eloquent statement of why he opposed the bank. So I'd like to take a minute to read it. So this is President Andrew Jackson on why we don't need a central bank. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions, but every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, that is, from the government, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. If government would confine itself to equal protection of the laws, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, that is, the chartering of the Bank of the United States, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. And so that was his statement, of his veto statement. And I dug up, so I did a little digging to find out, well, what are some of the historians, the American historians, saying about this statement that Jackson made? And one of my favorite historical biographers is a man named Robert Remini. And he says that historians call this statement, quote, beneath contempt. So that's beneath contempt. It's an outrage that he should be condemned for saying such things out there. And so this was revived. Central banking become much more centralized in America during the American Civil War in the 1860s. And I'd like to read to you a statement by the famous newspaper man of the time named Horace Greeley of what he saw as the meaning of this resuscitation of central banking. When they passed the National Currency Acts in the 1860s, he said, the purpose of this measure is to institute such a connection between the public credit and the banking interest as shall, on the one hand, give the President virtual control of all the banks in the country, and on the other, make every stockholder and banknote holder in the land an underwriter, so to speak, of the government bonds, effectively harmonizing the interests of both government and the people, end quote. And a little background on this idea of harmonizing interests of bondholders and the people. That was Hamilton's idea. The reason he gave for a large public debt was that he believed that the bondholders, people who own government bonds, will be mostly the more affluent or wealthy people of the country. They would therefore have an incentive to lobby for and promote higher taxes and bigger government to make sure there was enough money in the Treasury to pay off their bonds. And so Horace Greeley here, many years later, 70-some years later, is saying, we have achieved that with the National Currency Acts. That was his rationale. A senator, an influential senator of the time, Senator John Sherman, the brother of the famous General Sherman, he said, as a result of the revival of central banking, a powerful national government and an internationally dominant American nation would arise. So that's the American empire, in other words. The New York Times said, commented on the Lincoln regime's nationalized banking and said it, quote, crystallized a centralization of power such as Hamilton might have eulogized as magnificent. And of course, it did what central banking always does. The greenbacks, the currency at the time, depreciated to a value of only 35 cents worth of gold in about a year and a half during that time. So there was a war going on, and it created massive inflation during the war. And of course, the final centralization of the money supply came with the Fed in 1913. And ever since then, what have we gotten? Perpetual boom and bust cycles created by the Fed. Most importantly, it adds to what some economists call fiscal illusion. A good example of this is when the Vietnam War was financed largely by the printing of money, which created price inflation later. It reduces the perceived cost of war. Because if Lyndon Johnson were to say, well, we're going to have to impose a tax of $10,000 per family to finance this war in Vietnam, there would have been a lot more protest against that war than there already was. But if they can just simply print money, which creates inflation 2, 3, 4 years later, well, then that sort of eliminates the perceived cost of government, including the government's wars. Debt does the same thing. Public debt financed by money creation. And it's called fiscal illusion. And then once that occurs, once the government creates all this inflation, since most citizens are economically ignorant, it is very easy for the government to go out there and blame it all on capitalism. After all, who's charging all these high prices? It's the capitalists. It's the business people. And that's exactly what's happening today in America and around the world. The Fed has created this disaster, this depression that we're now in. And every branch of the federal government, it seems, is day in and day out condemning capitalism and free markets as the cause. And this is a very old story. They've always done this. The government has always created these problems and then blamed it on the free market. I wrote a short book about it called How Capitalism Saved America some years ago, precisely for this reason, that Americans have been taught mostly to endorse the destruction of the source of their own prosperity in this way, and hopefully people around the rest of the world won't fall for this. But that's who stands to benefit. It's the beneficiaries of the American empire, the business elites, certainly the banking elites. And of course, when we saw the U.S. government give $1 trillion to Wall Street investment bankers, I would think that should once and for all explain to everyone who the Fed and who the U.S. government really is working for. Despite all the rhetoric about economic stability and so forth, that's the rationale for the Fed. That seems to me that's the real purpose of it. And my time is about up. Thank you very much.